from the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Liberal Democrats. The appreciation felt by the people of Ukraine at the support offered by this House, the people of the United Kingdom, should not be underestimated. Indeed, his nightly address on Monday, President Zelensky explicitly expressed his thanks to the United Kingdom for the support provided to them. Order, order. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. John Grady.
Question number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, just picking up on your comments, can I say that on Monday night I spoke to President Zelensky and he wanted me to pass on to you his thanks for attending in Ukraine, particularly on the 3rd anniversary of the massacre at Bucha, which I've been to Bucha. It's a terrible, terrible 3rd anniversary, so I pass on those thanks. Mr. Speaker, we've been preparing for all eventualities ahead of the confirmation of US tariffs later today. Let me be clear with the House. A trade war is in nobody's interests, and the country deserves, and we will take, a calm, pragmatic approach. That's why constructive talks are progressing to agree a wider economic prosperity deal with the US. That's why we're working with all industries and sectors likely to be impacted. Our decisions will always be guided by our national interest, and that's why we have prepared for all eventualities, and we will rule nothing out. Mr. Speaker, our deepest sympathies are with the people of Myanmar and Thailand. We are sending immediate life-saving support to assist their efforts. May I also extend my personal condolences to the family, friends and colleagues of Christina McKelvey. She was much loved and will be sorely missed, especially by our colleagues in the SNP here and in Scotland. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the full state pension will rise by £472 a year, putting money in the pockets of pensioners in Glasgow and across the United Kingdom. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this rise is only possible because of Labour's plan for change and our commitment to the triple lock?
Well, he's absolutely right. We can commit to the triple lock because we've restored stability after they crashed the economy. And that means, Mr. Speaker, next week 12 million pensioners will receive up to £470 more. That's an extra £1,900 over this Parliament, including 1 million pensioners in Scotland. And the contrast couldn't be clearer. The Shadow Chancellor called the triple lock unsustainable, and the Leader of the Opposition wants to means test the state pension so that she can cut it.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, the triple lock was a Conservative policy. Rather than...
Order. I know... You was inadvertently said. Carry on, Leader.
Rather than the Prime Minister congratulating himself for what we did, why don't we talk about what he's doing? From Sunday, Labour's jobs tax will mean many British businesses face a terrible choice: to cut wages, put up prices or sack their staff. What is the Prime Minister's advice to those businesses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she says the triple lock was Conservative policy. It was once thought to be the party of sound finances, but they blew all of that. Mr. Speaker, she asked what we're doing. We're clearing up the mess that they left. We're dealing with global instability, and we recognise the pressures that are bearing down on businesses and individuals and working people. That's why we're rolling up our sleeves. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to announce the national living wage increasing by £1,400. That's a pay rise for millions of workers. we've announced £150 for the Warm Homes discount, extended now to 6 million households. That's 1 in 5 families. And wages are going up faster than prices. And never forget, the party opposite, worst living standards on record, inflation up to 11%, public services left on their knees.
Mr. Speaker, the only mess is the one that he made with his budget. They had an emergency budget last week that fixed nothing. He says he's bringing stability. All we see is fragility. During the election, the Prime Minister also promised that he would not increase taxes on working people. But even the OBR says that the jobs tax will be passed on to workers. On average, families will be £3,500 poorer. Why should anyone trust him again?
Prime Minister.
Well, her fantasy figure is about as much use as Liz Truss's economic planning. And she turns up every week to carp from the sidelines about the decisions we made at the budget. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, she held a press conference and she couldn't say whether she would reverse the decisions that we made at the budget. Now, I understand, because she can't bring herself to say that she doesn't want the investment of an extra £26 billion in our NHS. I'm not surprised at that. That's 2 million extra appointments, that's 1,000 more GPs, a pay rise for nurses, etc., etc. But let me get her position right if I can follow it. She wants the extra £26 billion in the NHS, Mr. Speaker, that was paid for by the national insurance rise. She wants that. She doesn't want to reverse the national insurance rises. So she's now reduced this absurd position of voting in the budget, carping against a budget that she actually agrees with.
Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with making people poorer. I don't agree with pensioner poverty. I don't agree. Out there, they are calling it awful April. That's because of decisions he has made, because he made promises and broke them. His promises are worthless, Mr. Speaker. People are getting poorer. Before the election, he pledged to freeze council tax. Instead, it's going up everywhere. Even in Birmingham, where there's 17,000 tonnes of rubbish uncollected on the streets. Does the Prime Minister regret promising the British people he would freeze their council tax when he has so obviously failed?
Prime Minister.
Well, I have to ask, if she doesn't want people to be poorer, why didn't she resign when she was in government? Mr. Speaker, the last government put up council tax for 12 years in a row. She, I think, was actually Minister for Council Tax. And in the year she's been, what she do? She put it up. And even now, the Conservatives' own Local Government Association manifesto, so currently their position, page 9, we asked the government to remove the caps on council tax. So who's leading the charge? Hampshire County Council, they wanted a 15% hike, we said no. Slough Council wanted a hike, we said no. Windsor and Maidenhead was Tory, now Lib Dem. They wanted to hike and we said no. And it's no surprise that council tax is £300 cheaper under Labour councils than under Tory councils.
Mr. Speaker, he doesn't want to talk about Birmingham, and that's because he knows the situation. So I'll say it again. 17,000 tonnes of rubbish on Birmingham streets. Normally, a state of emergency is called for natural disasters, not Labour ones. His policies have left our economy dangerously fragile. The Chancellor, once again, left herself no room for manoeuvre. Economic experts, real economists, say she will either have to break her fiscal rules or put up taxes. Which will it be?
Prime Minister.
I think she must have picked up the script she was using a few weeks ago. Because it was only then she was saying, in the spring statement, you're going to put up taxes. But look, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the situation in Birmingham, it is completely unacceptable. I fully support the Council in declaring it a major incident to resolve the situation, and we'll put in whatever additional support is needed. But when the party opposite was in government, we lost more days to strike action than in any year since the 1980s. NHS workers were on the picket line, not on the front line, and that sent waiting lists through the roof, so we'll take no lectures on industrial harmony from them.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House would have heard that he didn't say whether or not he could keep his fiscal rules. That means that it's either that or putting up taxes. 9 months ago, we left Labour the fastest growing economy in the G7. We did. And I remember watching his MPs laughing at their first destructive budget. They've had another one that has made our economy dangerously vulnerable. The Bank of England says his policies have pushed up the cost of living for families. Does he disagree with the bank, or does he accept his policies mean higher bills?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she must be the only person left in the country who actually thinks they did well on the economy when they were in power. That was what was tested at the last election. Living standards the worst on record. Inflation, 11% it soared up to. The NHS on its knees. Oh, Mr. Speaker, she's so obsessed with talking down the country that she's not read the OBR forecast properly. Growth up in 2026, 2077 up, 2028 up, 2029 up. And thanks to our planning reforms, the largest growth measure the OBR have ever costed. And what did the Tories do when the bill came before Parliament? They abstained. Well, you don't grow the economy or build houses by assembly. They're the same old party. They haven't changed. Nothing's new.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about inflation. We left it at 2%. It is now twice what the OBR forecast when we were in government. The fact is, his decisions have made our economy fragile, just as we face global trade wars. In November, I urged him to seize the draft US trade deal Conservatives negotiated. Instead, Mr. Speaker, he lost our most experienced trade negotiator. It's no wonder he can't get a tariff deal for British cars. On this side of the House, we secured investments for that industry, £600 million from BMW, £2 billion from Nissan, £4 billion from Jaguar Land Rover. Labour's record is a car industry in crisis, even before tariffs. There are 25,000 more jobs now at risk. He says he's preparing for eventualities. Can the Prime Minister tell us exactly what he is doing to protect the British car industry from his failure to negotiate?
Prime Minister.
We're taking a calm, pragmatic approach and keeping our feet on the ground. There are constructive talks that are ongoing on a wider economic prosperity deal with the US. That is really important at this moment. We are working with all sectors that are likely to be impacted, and we're guided by our national interest at all times. And that's why we've said we won't rule anything out. But it is important at a moment like this that we don't have knee-jerk reactions, that we are actually cool-headed about this, and that's why we won't rule anything out. But she must be. She's the Trade Secretary. She was the Trade Secretary, Mr. Speaker, who failed to get a trade deal with the US.
Mr. Speaker, today the Trump administration will announce new tariffs that will hurt working people in the US and around the world. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that at a time when big tech has grown fat by corrupting our politics and preying on young people, that the wrong approach would be to pander to his bullying tactics and detect millionaires in his imperial court by cutting the digital services tax? Can he assure the public that the poorest won't get cuts while the richest get a free ride?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this. It is an important issue, and there are issues in relation to Northern Ireland in particular that we have to deal with very carefully. We will, Mr. Speaker, always put the national interest first, and that's why I'm pleased that talks are ongoing and they're constructive talks. I do believe that a trade war is in nobody's interest, and all of the sectors and industries impacted are of the same view. So we'll continue to make that progress in the national interest.
The Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the earlier remarks of the Prime Minister, particularly about Myanmar and Thailand? And can I support the aid that is going and hope that despite the budget cuts we can be as generous as possible because of the humanitarian crisis there? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has shown commendable leadership over Ukraine with his plan for a military coalition of the willing against Putin? Will he now provide similar leadership with an economic coalition of the willing against Trump's tariffs for free trade so we can avoid a global trade war and a global recession?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think every week he tries to tempt me to make what I think is a false choice between our relationship with the US and our relationship with other countries, particularly Europe. I think that's the wrong choice on defence, on security intelligence, for reasons that we've rehearsed across this chamber. I also think it's wrong on trade and the economy. We have a good deal of trade, a balanced trade relationship with the US, and I believe that our interests are best served by calmly trying to secure a deal which is in our national interest, whilst at the same time preparing and leaving all options on the table.
Sir Ed Davey.
Minister's reply. I hope he is able to cut a deal, but I increasingly fear that the deal won't be good enough to avoid a global trade war. That's why I think one of the options must be to work with our European allies, our Commonwealth allies and others, because if we don't tackle Trump's tariffs, we could be saying goodbye to free trade for a generation. Mr. Speaker, if I may turn to a domestic matter now. 3 years ago, the American private equity firm KKR bought a 25% stake in Northumbrian Water. Since then, people across the North East have seen their water bills soar, whilst in last year alone, Northumbrian Water has dumped nearly 1 million tonnes of raw sewage into Durham's Whitburn Coast Conservation Area. KKR are now poised to buy into Thames Water because ministers have ruled out a special administration regime. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that Thames Water will not be allowed to repeat the same trick of putting up bills and dumping raw sewage at the same time? They allowed it, he shouldn't.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to his comments at the beginning of the question, I really do think it's not sensible to say the first response should be to jump in to a trade war with the US. That cannot be the first response of the United Kingdom, and I will resist his urgings to do that. In relation to water, he's absolutely right to point out the appalling record on water of the party opposite, just like your record on everything was appalling, and that's why I'm really pleased that we passed the Water Act already to take the necessary measures, but we will go further.
Deputy.
Yesterday, the Work and Pension Select Committee visited Manchester, where we saw the power of devolution in action, in this case helping people find work. So with just 5 percentage points separating Labour and Conservative last time, does the Prime Minister agree that to get the maximum advantage from Labour's devolution offer, the West of England needs an ambitious Labour Mayor in Helen Godwin for more jobs, to fix our buses and to get the homes we need built?
I believe it's best for communities when their leaders have skin in the game. Helen Godwin grew up in Stapleton, went to college in Filton, and has a great record fighting for the community where she's raising her family. Mr. Speaker, our plan for change has delivered record funding for the West of England. That's more money for better buses, for potholes, and getting young people into work. That's the difference a Labour Mayor working with a Labour government delivers for the West of England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that many in the House will be assuaged by his suggestion that he will act in the national interest in relation to tariffs. But most won't have considered that in acting in the national interest, what occurs in Northern Ireland is no longer solely in his control. He knows that exports from Northern Ireland are UK exports, rightly so. Yet imports to Northern Ireland could lay at the consequence of EU retaliatory action. In keeping all of his options open, now we have to live in a world with the consequences of the last government with his support. Will he indicate that he is prepared to take steps to either exempt Northern Ireland from EU action or take retaliatory action if they do not?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank him for raising this issue, which is of real importance to his constituents and everybody in Northern Ireland. It is a very serious issue. That's why we need to be calm and pragmatic. And I think that's what workers and businesses in Northern Ireland would want to see from this government at a time like this. We are, as you would expect, looking carefully at the details